Welcome to Your Story Medicine. Today, I am with Nisha Mody, who is a South Asian American daughter of immigrants. She is a feminist healing coach, writer, and library advocate who hypes up humans who love to help others to return to themselves by moving beyond self-care culture. She has a background as a speech language pathologist, a librarian, recruiter, consultant, voiceover artist, so many different things. And all of this has led her to create spaces of connection, liberation, collective care, and healing. Most importantly, Nisha has been such a value to my life as well as to my students inside of Roots to Rise because of the ways that she has embodied everything it is that she talks about. And it is done from this anti-oppressive lens. Nisha is also an alumni of Roots to Rise, and I have brought her in as a co-conspirator because I cannot hold this container on my own. And so I'm so grateful for the role that Nisha has played in not just my life, but the lives of my students, as well as her community. And if you don't follow her Instagram, go and check it out, Healing Hype Girl, where you are going to find so much inspiration, especially if you are a woman of color or a child of immigrant that struggles with setting boundaries. So welcome, Nisha.
Thank you so much, June. I'm so excited to be here.
So let's go back to the roots and to ask, what is it that you're celebrating about
Mm.
yourself today?
Yeah, I'm really celebrating not attaching my worth to specific outcomes lately. That's been felt really good to me. And it's something that I've been exploring myself and connecting it to things that I, do in my work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I know that you talk so much about how like so many of us are equating our worth to our capacity to be able to give more and do more. And so I am also like super excited to dive deeper into this topic. But if we can take away all of your titles and like I love how I've been able to dig deep into your story medicine and how you have been
Mm.
able to switch careers multiple times in your life and just start over again. I feel like that is so much of your medicine. But how is it that you would describe what it is you do outside of all the roles that you had?
Yeah, thank you so much. One thing that I will go back to you digging into my story that you helped me realize was how I wasn't willing to settle for doing things that didn't like light me up. And my medicine is really connecting people with ideas through this warm and delightful like ethos that I bring to the table. And I feel like so much of what I do is to connect people with me, connect with themselves, and connect them to each other. And that's where I talk about moving away from that hashtag self-care culture and moving toward collective care and how we all are serving each other in like beautiful, absolutely beautiful ways. And how that can be a norm, whether someone is paying me as a coach or whether I just like meet someone somewhere. There is equal value in both of those.
Yeah, hashtag self-care is something that I feel like I'm going to be unpacking for the rest of my life because it's like, why is it that we even need self-care in the first place?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. That actually just brought up something that I saw recently. Someone posted about how oftentimes self-care is actually aftercare as a result of like
Mm,
the crappy, oppressive things in this world. And also, I don't think it's a bad thing to focus on ourselves. I think we are individual human beings and we have to look at ourselves and we have to see our shadows and see how we are a mirror for others and others are a mirror for us. And how can we support each other because none of us are perfect. We're all imperfect human beings that have gifts and flaws, and that all makes us whole, and we can ask for help and support each other. How can we redefine our jobs and vocations into the roles that we have as a collective and communities? And how is that actually the antithesis of self-care? You know what I mean?
Yeah. And when I think about how it is that how our ancestors operated, or like it, it was all collectivism, right? We showed up for each other's. I mean, I also want to be very cautious about glorifying how it is our ancestors worked. But I feel like so much of decolonizing what wellness looks like is by um, knowing that we can lean on each other for support. But I feel the challenge with that is, how is it that we are also mindful of our boundaries when it comes
Yeah.
to caring for others? Because it's like one thing to create this culture shift, and it's another thing to martyr ourselves for the
Mm.
sake of liberation. And so this is something that I feel is just like taught within our families, especially for those of us who do come um, from parents that immigrated here. And so let's dig into your ancestral lineage, and how is it that this has influenced the medicine it is that you share today?
Yeah, sure. So I am the daughter of, South Asian immigrants. My parents both grew up in Mumbai, India. And my always talk about how my mom was born the year of the partition in India. And I feel like that's so significant for me because it shows that influence of colonization. It shows the scarcity mindset too, because whenever I ask my mom what she experienced growing up, especially being a child who, newly was in a new kind of a new country in many ways that was colonized and exploited. How did that show up for her? And she always gives the example about how she had to wait in line for rations. And, and that's really all she says. And I often think about how that might have influenced her own scarcity, especially being the oldest of four daughters. And my father, too, he didn't really talk much about his family at all growing up. And to me, and from other things I've heard, I think he had a very hard time growing up. They really didn't have money, and my parents came here and made a beautiful life for themselves to a point where and I never worried about food being on the table growing up. Like I knew we weren't rich, and I knew like, I always had to cut the coupons and do all the things so we could save money. And I wasn't like worried about food security or housing security. And it's because of what my parents did so that they didn't have to experience that as they did when they were younger. And at the same time, it shows up in different ways. My father passed away 10 years ago. But my mom still has this like, oh, we're not doing enough. Things aren't enough. Like, what else do we need to do? What else do we need to talk about? It shows up in so many ways that she speaks to me in conversations. Like, without fail, every end of our conversation, she's like, but what else? What else do we need to talk about? I'm like, maybe there's nothing else. Maybe you can call me back or text me because that's what we can do these days, But that shows me how embodied that mindset and that um, scarcity is with her, and I feel like I'm in a place where I can move from that intergenerational trauma to intergenerational healing. I can break those cycles. And one huge way I've done that is by making boundaries. And I'm so glad that you mentioned, how to do that so we aren't like a martyr, especially when so many of us might come from more collective cultures, right? Where community was the norm, helping each other was the norm. And I think it's such a fascinating juxtaposition, growing up in this hyper individualistic culture in America, which also is harmful, and seeing the connection between how my ancestors and many, people of color needed each other, to survive, and how that was essential to their survival and to them being able to work together and stick together. And now things have shifted a little bit, right? So I don't no longer need to do the things that my mom might want me to do to like keep the family together to in order to survive. And yet that nervous system trauma response is very ingrained in her. So how are we differentiating collective care and community care with maybe a trauma response that happened, like because of this need for this community and solidarity, which I completely respect and admire. But how can I redefine it within the boundaries that support my well-being so that I can show up for the collective?
Yeah, it's like, so my mom, when I ask about her childhood and what is it that led her to the United States, I mean, she came by choice. But she left her village when she was 14 years old. And she tells me about how growing up, she never had privacy. She lived in this, it was still a hut on stilts because during monsoon season, everything floods and nobody had their own room. And she had 7 other siblings as well as other children that her parents took in. And even though there was so much community, there was so much life for her growing up, what she craved was privacy. And
Mm.
so when I came into this world, after she had already established herself, her and my dad, they weren't apartment hopping anymore. They finally got a house. Here I am in this like 5-bedroom home in the suburbs. I have my own room. Even though we don't come from intergenerational wealth, this is a stamp of the American dream. And I often
Mm.
think about how, because I didn't grow up with that community, with a lot of siblings like her, with that village, it's why I am so motivated to recreate that for myself,
Mm.
which is honestly why I have the business that I do and why it is I attract people like you who are also looking for that sense of community and belonging that maybe our parents or our grandparents had. But here it's like they've had to release all of that in order to assimilate in
Mhm.
American culture. And then also it's like, oh, you can't be vulnerable. You can't express yourself because that's dangerous. We're outsiders here. We have to keep our head down. And so what ends up happening is a lot of that repressed grief ends up being put onto the kids. I feel that with my own parents. Um, I talked about this with Leslie of Latinx parenting, of how it's like violence is actually not a part of our culture. It's something that is
Mm.
learned as a means to survive. And so um, curious in the ways that you are experiencing um, intergenerational healing with between you and your mother as you are embodying the very things that you are teaching to your clients.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And thank you so much for sharing your story because that, while there's differences, there's so much like synchronicity and similarities in terms of the transition between like cultures and geography. Yeah. So one thing that really shifted my relationship with my mom was making boundaries with her. There was a time where she expected immediate calls back from me, expected that I visit her all the time. And I had to start saying no. And she didn't like that. And she would get in arguments with me about it. And I just had to stick to it. With that being said, that doesn't mean that like I haven't slipped up or not maintained my boundaries. That happens. We're human beings. But by remembering, why I'm making this boundary and how that's going to be helpful for me, because I think boundaries not only allow us to have a relationship with these people in our lives, but also helps give me space so I can even think for myself. I can think, what does Nisha even need? Because that's something that sometimes takes years to find out. It's not like I make a boundary for a week and I know exactly what I need to do and what I need for myself. It takes a really long time to unmask and uncover what is beneath all this conditioning and all these expectations and the guilt and all that, those feelings, right? And so that, I probably started making my boundaries with my mom like, I don't know, over 10 years ago. And that itself has been its own journey, but it's come to a point where even just this past year, these past few months, I'm noticing that when I talk to my mom, I'm just not as triggered by things she says about me because I'm like, oh, wow, she really doesn't know how to deal with her feelings. She has to project them on me. Or I could say, hey, okay, thanks for sharing, but I got to go. And then what I do in those moments is sometimes it doesn't affect me. Other times I allow myself to listen to my body, feel what's coming up for me, try to understand how those feelings and sensations are protecting me. I reach out to people who are safe to me, so that I can manage myself so that when I talk to my mom next, I'm not therefore projecting the stuff that was protecting me back on her. You know what I mean? And I think that cycle can often get us like confused and mixed up. So by allowing myself to take care of myself, I'm also then not feeding into a cycle of communication, of norms, of boundary violations that were the norm for me growing up. The same types of fights and same conversations, that I'm like, I'm not going there anymore. I don't want to. And what I've noticed is that now when I talk to my mom, like about the work I do, for example, which I've now told her, I'm like, yeah, it's very much informed by what I saw with you growing up, what I experienced with you. And I know that like things weren't as easy for you and you had to build a whole life. And now I get to do something different. And in one of my most recent conversations where I talked to her about my program from work to worth, she was asking me about it. And I said, you know, so much of this is because of how hard I saw you worked and how I see that you still feel like it's not enough. And I want to talk to people about how they are enough, and even you about how you are enough, and how you don't have to reach XYZ goal. And thinking about the great things we have already done. And she's like, wow, Nisha, that's so good that you get to work with people and do that. And I was like, is this conversation happening? Like, it was so
Wow.
wild and beautiful. And now she like wishes me luck on text before I do workshops that she knows about and just stuff like that, that I'm like, wow, we are really healing. And putting boundaries with her over 10 years ago was the first step to doing that. And that's why it's like this hashtag self-care culture shifts from being like, yes, I did make boundaries so I could return to myself, but also so I could return to her. Maybe that wasn't the intention, but I have to do that so that I can be with my community. I can be with the collective to see what is possible.
Well, I think it's first important for us to redefine what boundaries even are,
Mhm.
because people tend to see boundaries as a hard wall versus an opportunity to say, I love you, but it has to be like, I'm not really like under these conditions, but like, in order for me to love you, this is a need that needs to be met. Um, and then also, I am thinking about how our moms didn't have their moms around.
Mm.
Like my grandmother was in
Yeah.
Thailand the whole time. She came once to help take care of me when I first came into the world because my parents were working so much. And my sister, she was in school, and my sister didn't have that opportunity to be raised by her grandparents. And my grandparents wanted a different experience for me, but they got so homesick. My grandma came first. Um, I remember my mom telling me a story of how there was an earthquake that happened, and she was at this house by myself. She was at the house by herself with me, and she had never experienced an earthquake before. And she freaked out, ran outside into the middle of the street, and the neighbors came out, and she was like pointing to the house because she couldn't speak English. Thankfully,
Oh.
I was okay. My mom tells me it's why I'm so hard-headed. Like I rolled out of the bed, but I'm fine. But yeah, grandpa came shortly afterwards to be with my grandma, but they both got so homesick that they left. And so I think about the ways that our mothers had to essentially mother themselves in this
Mm.
country, or even if they had their mothers here, they had to be the bridge between both of these worlds. And then here we are being the ones who are a bridge between America and our more independent upbringings, and then our parents who came from collectivism and yet are also learning how to be independent in a country where they are made to feel like they don't belong.
Whew, wow. When you just said like them having to mother themselves or not having their moms around, that just like, I got so many feelings in my heart and tingles in my body just thinking about how that's so true and how, even though I've had challenging times and conversations and arguments and even harmful cycles of gaslighting and, just hurtful comments and criticism from my mom, like she didn't have her mom here when my brother and I were born. I think my grandparents came maybe once or maybe twice, but they weren't able to stay long, too long. And it still wasn't the same, as having someone around the corner. So yeah, it's so true. And it makes me think about the times where I felt like my mom was so angry and just yelling at us and criticizing us because she couldn't handle her own nervous system, and I have so much compassion for that now, as I'm growing older and like, running my own place. And I don't even have kids, you know what I mean? It's a lot of work to manage life, be an adult. So I'm so grateful that you shared that because yeah, like so much, like, yeah, so many tingles came up. And I do think it's important to redefine boundaries as having that good relationship with them. And also, this is what I value. And if you want more of me as Nisha as she is, I have to have this boundary so that I can really feel like myself. And so you can get to know who I am, while I get to know who I am, and I think it's actually a gift to do that for others while we do that for ourselves, for them to see who we are. And I'm forgetting what you said toward the end there. I'm sorry. I'm just like, I feel like, I don't know if you posed a question or a thought, but can you refresh my
Yeah,
memory?
well, no, absolutely. Well, redefining what boundaries are,
Mhm.
which I think that you did so beautifully. And how is it then if our parents were never really shown how to do this compassionate parenting, um, how is it that you respond to your mom saying that you I mean, you're not deliberately saying I'm placing a boundary, but
Mhm.
like when we place a boundary, it can be perceived as us being lazy, as us not being a good enough
Mhm.
daughter or a contributing member of society.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So one thing I always tell folks, I've run this program, Boundaries for BIPOC, a couple times, is that you're making a boundary for yourself, and another person might react in a way that we don't like, and that's not our responsibility. And so, really thinking about how I'm not making a boundary so someone follows it. I'm making it so I can have a relationship with them, and also considering the ways that if I feel discomfort and making a boundary, it's because my nervous system is not used to it. You know what I mean? And sitting with that discomfort and being with that discomfort and seeing how that discomfort has helped me my whole life when I had fewer choices. When I was a teenager, I couldn't just leave home. You know what I mean? I couldn't say, no, I'm not going to come down to, like hang out with you or whatever, because we were in the same household, they could just come up to me. I can't have physical space as much as I do now, but now I do have choices. And so, really being with my choices, celebrating the choices that I do have. And I often say to people, and this isn't for everyone, some people really don't have choices. But let's just think about like when you're in a good grounded state and really like in a regulated state with your nervous system, or at the very minimum, tending to your nervous system, what choices do I have right now? And how do those choices honor who I am? And how is this also a choice for me that, yes, someone else might not like it? And that actually means that I am changing patterns. Like, let me celebrate that. Let me celebrate them being uncomfortable. You know what I mean? Let me celebrate them arguing with me about this because that means I am shifting things. And this is a long game. I think really thinking about boundaries as a long game is really, really important. And just knowing that, yeah, it's not going to feel that great. And I am shifting patterns. And one thing I really think that you've helped me think about is how I'm an ancestor in the making. So how is this going to set an example for others? How are they going to see this and think, yeah, Nisha did it or June did it. And like, I can probably do this. Because when we have no examples of people that are shifting behaviors and shifting patterns and healing intergenerationally in this way, then we feel bad, we feel guilty, we feel like we're doing something that is wrong. So seeing it, having those examples, I think is really helpful for us.
You and I work with big-hearted people who know that they are meant to help alleviate the suffering of the planet. And
Mm-hmm.
I even experienced this for myself back when I was working um, in my nonprofit, feeling guilty when I when I wanted to say no.
Mm-hmm.
And I experience this so much, whether it comes to work, especially if you are in a position where you are helping others and doing that as a living, or when it comes to family members or friends asking for our help. It's like oftentimes many of us have conditioned ourselves to feel obliged to show up in urgency,
Mm-hmm.
especially when there is crisis. We make other people's crisis our own. And I experience this so much with my clients as well, who have told me that they want to spend time with their families, but work demands so much of them, or they want time for themselves, quote unquote, self-care, but their families
Mm-hmm.
need them too much. And the next thing you know, it's like there's no time available just for them or to do the things that bring them joy. And so while we can explore what it looks like to create boundaries with other people, I feel like what's less discussed are the boundaries that we put in place for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, so how is it that you have had to learn how to place these boundaries of saying no so that you can honor the times to refill your own cup? And then also, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, one thing that I always start with is values. What do I value on a larger level? And then what do I value when I'm thinking about my time? What feels good for me? And when I create a value with myself and with others that is based on a value and the things that are important to me, then it feels like something different. It doesn't feel punitive, because I think sometimes we're like, I need to do this. Okay, I gotta block this time, or else blah, blah, blah. It's like we're punishing ourselves. But how can I make this joyful? How could I think about what really matters to me? And like, I think slow down. I'm glad that you mentioned urgency, because especially people with like so many responsibilities and obligation, it's almost easier to keep repeating the cycles, even if it sucks, even if it doesn't feel good, because it's easier to do that than slow down and shift and make changes, because our body is just going to be like, no, I want to just be used to the thing that I'm used to, even if it doesn't feel that great. Right. So I think really thinking and sitting down and reflecting on what I value and how certain things in my life that I'm doing are violating those values before thinking about how it's violating my boundaries, and doing it from a place of compassion and curiosity. Because I think a lot of self-judgment could start coming. It's like, oh God, yeah, I shouldn't do that, blah, blah, blah. Like take that word should out of our vocabulary, right? And it's like, but I do. And this is why. And let me have compassion for myself. Let me hug myself. Let me talk to someone, who has compassion for me and who's safe for me, and work through it and see like, okay, how can I meet this value? What does 10% of me looking and meeting this value look like? When I am running to someone's rescue, how does my value of compassion look for others? And how does it look for myself? Where does the value of vulnerability show up with others and myself? Like maybe I could say, hey, I've been having a really hard time lately. I've been getting really bad sleep, and I really want to help you, but I really need to, catch up on my sleep right now so that I can show up for you. Like how do these values actually connect to the action that we need? And we can get hyper specific too. So for me, a lot of these boundaries have looked like my calendar. Like if I love connecting with others and keeping up with others. And if I say, hey, let's catch up, and they want to talk next week, let me think if that actually, let me look at what's happening with me. Let me think about my flow and my rhythm and what I need on a weekly basis. I need space to think. I need time for activity, physical activity. I need time to go on walks. I like my solo creative time, my time with my partner, with time with my mom and other friends. And then how does that fit in the larger picture to accommodate my flow and accommodate the way that I can best show up for that person when I'm in a conversation? And a great example of this is that this past weekend, I was just telling you earlier, my purse was stolen. And I had a phone date with a new Instagram friend that next day. And I was like, you know what? I just don't know if right now I'm in a place to have a conversation with this person who I think is super cool, but I'm having an emotional hangover from like this thing that just happened to me. And so I just messaged them and I was like, hey, this happened. And I really feel like I just like kind of need to just chill and like be with my feelings and, just be alone right now. And I don't know if I could really show up the way I want to for this conversation. And they were like, yeah, that's totally cool. Whereas, a year ago, I might have pushed myself to have that conversation. So how is making those cancellations actually me showing up for that person too, even though I'm not, physically showing up in the way that it was expected? So these are some ways that like with my calendar and my time is like a huge way that I do these things for myself. And I also do it with like, when I talk about self-care, like things like flossing, like making sure that I wash my face. Like, how does this help me feel better in the morning? You know what I mean? How will I wake up feeling more refreshed for the following day so that I can once again show up for the people in my life, whether that's professional or personal or whatever. So these are the things that I do, and I really talk about showing up. There's Mia Birdsong has a book called Showing Up, and she talks about like showing up for community and how that includes boundaries for ourselves, because sometimes saying no to others, it's saying yes to ourselves so that we can then show up for others too. So yeah, that would be how it shows up for me and how I think it can show up for other people too, really connecting to those values.
Yeah, something that has helped me is that I go to a yoga studio. I have my dance classes, and then lately I just started taking singing lessons, and it's on my calendar. And so when people ask me if I'm available, I'm like, no, I actually, I have plans already. And so I tell people if it's not on my calendar, it doesn't exist. But for me, participating in those activities is actually like my lifeline, especially because I'm holding space all day. I need those somatic releases. And my challenge, because I'm now like staying with my parents and I'm helping them, especially as they're getting older, is like releasing feeling guilty whenever they question why it is I am not home in the evenings. But I think we're always
Mm-hmm.
going to be like little kids in their eyes, no matter how old we are.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I could be running a successful 6-figure business and they still won't care.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Where's your jacket? Where are you going? Have you eaten yet? And so I embrace those moments. But you use Care Bear as
Mhm.
a metaphor to your work. So tell us
Yeah.
a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So Care Bears. First of all, I loved Care Bears when I was a child. That was when the original TV show came on in the mid 80s. And what I love about the Care Bears is that I feel like they're a beautiful metaphor for our inner worth. And when I talk about our inner worth, there's even like a grumpy Care Bear. It's called Grumpy Bear. And it shows how we all have these unique qualities and strengths. But also, when the Care Bears get together, they do what they call their Care Bear stare, where they hold each other's hands and their care shines out from their bellies together out in the world. And what I love about this is not just that they always start with their worth, with no matter what they do, and they remember what's so great about them, and they're not sitting there overthinking about like what they should do or what they should achieve. They start with what's within them and they ask for help, and they share care in a collective way. And this is kind of another thing. It's a call to they care for themselves and their inner worth and their Care Bear belly, but then they ask for help. They're like, hey, what can you do? And they all think, about their own values and their own worth, and they shine it out to the world. And they have, even their flaws make them hold. And it's just funny. You know what I mean? It's just such a whole holistic view of how we are as beings, like, and just a shout out to the idea that we're human beings, not human doings, you know? And I really feel like what care is showing, how we can be with each other rather than what we have to chase after doing.
Curious if Grumpy Bear is like the bad Care Bear nobody wants to be, or if these feelings that we associate as negative also serve a purpose.
Yeah. So Grumpy Bear kind of points out, like, oh, well, this, that's not a good idea because of this. There's like, let me point out the issues and problems, which I think is important in this world. We need to analyze and we need to say, like, oh, well, what might be hard about this? He kind of wants to be alone, but at the same time, he'll eventually want to be with people, So I think that goes to show how we need people in our lives that will point out like issues or like challenges, and so that we don't go into things like, just willy-nilly. And we have like not just, I wouldn't say a voice of reason, but like just a voice that's like, hey, this is going to be a problem. And then the, Funshine Bear can be like, yeah, but like, then we could do it this way, now that we know this, So I feel like that's kind of what Grumpy Bear is showing, that we need those people in our lives. They have value. They aren't like a negative Nancy necessarily, but also to show kind of what you said, that these quote unquote negative feelings are feelings that we need to be with. They are important signals to us that, we want to protect ourselves, that our body wants to protect us always. And that these quote unquote negative, I'm always going to say quote unquote negative feelings, are there for a reason. They are there as information, not for something to avoid. The more we avoid those feelings, the more they're going to show up for us in some other way and manifest in other ways. Like, our feelings will always catch up to us no matter what. So when we actually address them and we be with our feelings, there's so much beauty, and again, collective care that we can share with the world.
Mm. So, Nisha, what is it that you are currently doing to stay grounded in these times? And also, what is it that you are learning to release?
I love that. Yeah. One thing that is a very consistent grounding activity for me is every morning I just do like morning pages journaling, just letting out whatever's on my mind so that I can stay grounded in the day. And I noticed the days where I'm like, oh, I got up kind of later and I didn't have time to do it, or I didn't make time during the day, that I'm a little more in my head, So when I release those thoughts and I'll put them on paper and sit with them and even laugh at them, and just, not critique them, I'm able to literally release and stay grounded. And another thing I do is I reach out to people who are safe for me and talk about what's going on, talk about that little sneaky thought that I'm just like pushing to the back of my head, that when it comes out, I'm like, oh, I really needed to say that out loud, So those are some things I'm really doing to stay grounded. And also, again, going back to those, quote unquote negative feelings, like listening to them and not making my feelings a problem, knowing that their feelings are not problems. I am not my feelings. They're information, and they're there for me to listen and care for, So yeah, those are some few ways that I'm staying grounded these days. And at the same time, those are releases for me. And I would say generally I'm releasing the idea that my feelings are problems, releasing that the fact that, I am a problem, or the things that actually are often gifts for me that I feel like are problems are not problems. So yeah, I think sometimes we'll be like, oh, I'm anxious. That's a problem. It's like, no, you're anxious like any human being is. Like, being a human being is not a problem. So yeah, I think that would really, that would sum it up.
So, speaking of embodying ourselves as future ancestors, um, I love this question. If you could envision yourself as a future ancestor speaking to present day Nisha and all the other iterations of Nisha who was questioning what's next, what is it that you would say to her?
I would say to her that you did it. You've always been doing it. Everything that you were striving for was happening at the time you were striving for it. And to use the beautiful metaphors you've brought to the table, like you're just been planting seeds and look at the garden that you've grown with others, look at how your ancestors planted seeds for you to heal and look at what you've done for others and the example you've set. And yeah, just nothing was a problem all along. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful garden.
Nisha. So tell us about the what has sprouted from these seeds that you've planted, and what does the fruit of your labor look like nowadays? How is it that you are helping to spread the seeds of wisdom to your community?
Yeah. So, wow, I think they've planted in so many ways, and not just in the stuff I'm offering in the world, but just in this embodiment. Really, when I talk about making boundaries for others, like how does that look like for myself? Really starting with that so that when I share with others, it comes from a place of that embodiment and that trial and error, laughing at my mistakes and being okay with them. And in terms of what I'm putting out in the world, I am putting out programs like my Boundaries for BIPOC program and also my From Work to Worth program that redefines our relationship between work and worth, so that we are coming from that abundance of our worth as opposed from the scarcity of constantly chasing after our worth by feeling like we need to constantly work and work and work. And also not making work such a dirty word and how it could be super generative. So those are the seeds I'm planting with myself and with others, and just planting the seeds that the sprouts that will come, I have no idea what they're going to look like. And that's so, so exciting. Like I get to be surprised like every day, and how that uncertainty used to, and sometimes still does, but make me anxious. But now it's just like a delightfully joyful like endeavor and journey that's coming up.
And if there's anybody who has embodied that throughout their life, that is most definitely you, because like y'all,
Oh,
we've like
thank
barely
you.
scratched the surface of Nisha's story medicine, and the times that you've quit. And we tend to equate quitting as being a bad thing, but for you, it's like you have been so good at giving yourself permission to start over again, and something beautiful and in greater alignment has always
Mm.
come from that. And so I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for you as a co-conspirator, as a co-pilot, as both a student and a teacher. And so folks, go ahead and follow Healing Hype Girl, Nisha Mody. And thank you. Thank you for doing the work to make your ancestors proud.
And thank you. I'm so grateful to know you and be that co-conspirator in collective care as well.